Hi, everybody. We're just about to start. We're letting people file in slowly. All right. It's like we have people coming in. We'll just let them keep filing in. Hi, everyone. My name is Stada. I'm Al-Shabaka's U.S. Policy Fellow. I just want to thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to another episode of Al-Shabaka's Policy Lab series. So today we're going to be discussing the student protest movement that swept the US and the world at wide over the past couple of months and what lessons we can take from it moving forward. So I really don't think I need to do too much of a background here. This is, a story that we've been following closely for a long time now. But the last few months saw student protests and encampments across the country expressing solidarity with the Palestinians amid the ongoing genocide in Gaza and calling for divestment and cutting ties with Israel. The movement called out the US's unconditional support for Israel and, importantly, the role of universities and other institutions in upholding Israel's system of oppression. The student uprising built on long-held traditions of student activism and harkened back to the legacy of previous movements, such as the one against the war in Vietnam and against apartheid in South Africa. But they also emerged as the latest sign of a wider shift in public opinion on the Palestinian struggle for liberation that continues to be largely ignored by policymakers. So while most of the encampments have now been dismantled and thousands of student protesters have been arrested and punished, many have pointed out that this may only be the beginning. In this policy lab, Noor Juda and Kylie Broderick will share their insight into what drove this protest movement, its core demands, and the violent response that we saw. We'll also discuss what this all means moving forward and how we can build on this movement to strengthen Palestinian solidarity as we approach a return to campus in the fall and as students navigate the repressive structures that are arrayed against them. Noor is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at UCLA and a former President's and Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in geography at UC Berkeley. Her work examines mapping practices and indigenous survival and futures in settler states, highlighting how indigenous countermapping is both cartographic and decolonial praxis. Kylie is a PhD student and Mellon Fellow in Modern Middle Eastern History at the University of North Carolina. She is also the managing editor of Jadaliya, a coordinator for the Center of Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University, and teaches Middle East courses to K through 12 educators. So before we get into it, just a quick reminder about the format. I'll be posing questions to Kylie and Noor for the first 45 minutes, and then we'll save 10 to 15 minutes at the end or longer to get to questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions by clicking the Ask a Question button on the bottom of your screen. And remember, you can also vote on questions that you find particularly important. And we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible with the limited time that we do have. So let's get started. We have a lot to talk about. And Kylie, I wanted to start with you. Can you situate us here? Knowing that we've all been following this story for a long time now, but could you tell us a little bit more about the history of this protest movement, the specific demands that students are actually making to their administrations, and how that may differ from campus to campus?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Thank you so much, first of all, Tara, for inviting us. It's really an honor to speak alongside Noor, who's a pillar for the movement and also like someone I look up to personally. So I am very proud to be able to speak beside you today. Yeah, so it's sort of difficult to have a starting place, right? I think that the movement for Palestine on university campuses is nearly 3 decades old, at least in its like sort of largesse and strength. And the seeds of what we're seeing today are part of that lineage, right? They're not divorced from it. Just like the occupation did not begin by the Zionist entity on October 7th, neither did student activism for Palestine, and nor did sort of the kind of larger milieu of student activism for the cause of justice. But I think that maybe it's best just to start at October 7th, right? I know that for college campuses that Palestine solidarity organizations, especially SJPs, in the context of both Canada and the US across Turtle Island. Most of them were very quick to mobilize after October 7th, realizing that this was sort of a pivotal moment for the movement and one that we were called upon to act. Just speaking in the most general terms, most university campuses had demonstrations of various kinds, starting out with protests, rallies, solidarity pronouncements, and very quickly a lot of campuses sort of levied demands on their university administrations. I'd say the thing that really united them was the demand for divestment. Each university campus, especially because private universities and public universities are structured so differently, and then public universities themselves are quite different across every state in which they operate, and the sort of legal infrastructure is so different. Some states have anti-BDS laws, for instance, and some do not. They had very particular demands, right? And in the context of UNC Chapel Hill, the demands that we wrote up were related to, first and foremost, this transparency. Like most university campuses, we are aware that UNC's investments in Israel are quite profound in the university system. Like most college campuses, we also don't know what they are. So every university has made over the decades very concentrated attempts to sort of cover up the ways that they're spending college money, especially like public money, publicly seeded money. And so we can only sort of get glimpses at it. And each college campus, for that reason, has sort of made its major push to be about just having the university administrations lay out their cards in terms of what they're divesting or investing in order to start the divestment process. Since October 7th, many universities have actually started to be open about what they're investing in, and that's sort of the very first step. But in that sort of period of October and November and December in 2023, most universities met these demands for transparency, which is a very simple demand, actually. A very simple demand for public money especially should be made transparent, whatever it is invested in. Most universities met this with extreme prejudice and often force from their police departments. And I don't think there was a single university that sort of conceded to these transparency demands right off the bat. And so if we're speaking about the student encampment movement or the movement of the camps, this was a result of that intractability on the part of university administrators to have any sort of interest in engaging with the student demands, any interest in actually having a university be run by democratic values. And instead, they exercised their kind of long authoritarian arm in order to try to crush the movement. So the encampments were sort of that result, right? Like an attempt, many months of attempts in order to sort of speak to the university administrators to actually come to like an understanding of what the universities were investing in. And the encampments are a very, I think, beautiful attempt to take back that space, right? Like the space of the university is something that should be primarily for students, for faculty, and even to some extent for staff, especially like custodial staff who are the kind of working class underbelly that keep universities moving, and not the university administrators that are essentially the CEOs of the university, providing absolutely no value that we can see and are instead liabilities to the educational program for the most part at every university. So I think that like might be where it might be good to stop, that the encampments are the result of that demand, that very reasonable demand for transparency to not actually be met by the university. And all of these sort of encampment actions that have happened since then in their like longitude and their length, and I expect it will be a tactic that will be revisited, will be because universities refuse to actually meet with their students.
Thanks, Kylie. I kind of want to stay on that. I mean, I want to recognize that we're kind of in this transition phase over the summer, and this movement has in many ways only just begun. But I want to spend some time talking a little bit about the debate around, what the meaning of success is, right? And when it comes to the protest movement as a whole and on the more individual campus level, some say anything short of total divestment from Israel and cutting ties. And some of the other core protest demands cannot be, chalked up to as a success, while others have taken a more gradual approach to their demands. Can you, Noor, maybe going to you, can you tell us a little bit about how that conversation is unfolding in the environment that you're operating in, and what you've seen on your campus and what it means, I guess, for the wider movement nationwide moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, excuse me, to some degree, I think there's maybe a bit of a misconception too that such a conversation is always up to the students. So, of course, in regards to like willingness to negotiate details, what agreements look like or are signed off on, there is a lot of agency, right? I don't want to remove any of that. But in other ways, the university continues to wield a lot of power in the sense that many have outright refused, right, as Kylie mentioned, to engage with the organizers and their demands, not only for questions around disclosure and divestment, but now also after many of the camps have been violently cleared, right, demands around amnesty, for the larger group, or at UCLA, for example, even amnesty for the negotiating team to even be able to step foot in the door and feel as if they're in a space where they can actually have a negotiation and conversation without being subject to further discipline, right? And so I will say, I do think overall, though, in my opinion, it is accurate to say that there is a growing sense after some, let's say, not great deals that were struck, that increased intransigence is needed to some degree, and that's been recognized, I think, by a lot of campuses and student organizers nationally. And students at UCLA, for example, told the vice chancellor outright in what was one of my favorite lines from the year, "We will not let you task force us out of divestment." Right. So there is an understanding that some of these gradual processes, while needed, like disclosure as a first step is obviously needed to be able to fully kind of grasp the degree of divestment that's also being demanded. But that said, I think we also have to zoom out a bit. So yes, divestment is a main driver of this movement, but the driver of divestment is Palestine. And so what success looks like for these students is also about the degree to which they uplift Palestine as a place and as a cause, and the impact that they're having locally, nationally, globally on the solidarity movement itself, on advocating for liberation, for Palestinian liberation. And as we all know, that's not marked by a checklist of investments and divestments. It's part of it, right? And divestment is a tangible material contribution that they have, I think, accurately recognized and identified as a way to engage, and they're looking to make that happen. But when students escalate, they escalate for Gaza, they escalate for Rafah, they escalate for Palestinians the world over. And so at least I encourage them, or I try to, when they are down, and they have been down many times in the last few months especially, to try to recalibrate what we consider a good day, right? So a 10-hour day of actions on campus that ends with no arrests and engages thousands of people and does not let the university operate business as usual, as if we are not all living in the middle of a genocide and not working with institutions that are complicit in that genocide, right, is a success. That is a successful day on some level, even if that day doesn't end in a signed agreement. And so, I think that these are kind of important zoom out moments to also think about. There's also, I think, been a lot of discussion around student strategies, right? But these universities are also in conversation with each other. And there are shared strategies of policing, of repression, and honestly, extensive and very violent counterinsurgency on their part, right? So everything from what we've heard more about in the news, like bans from campus or housing evictions, to what we hear about a lot less, which is the instituting of private security forces on campus. And that's without us even getting to the militarization of campus police or local police that have been invited onto campus themselves. But these private security firms, who are seen, by the way, across regions in the US. So a firm like Apex Security, for example, has been seen across campuses all across the country, right? This is not unique to LA. Students have reported being followed home by men in plain clothes who they recognize from these firms, being filmed by them, extensive amounts of surveillance, being verbally threatened as they walk on campus. So all of this is to say that I think we also really need to be asking ourselves, what do university administrations consider successful repression in this moment? And then what does that mean for all of us? What does that mean for our students? What does that mean for our communities? Also in how we're moving forward, I think also.
Yeah, thanks, Noor, for touching on that. I was gonna jump into the security side of it later, but I think it's important to dive into that now. Sticking with you, Noor, could you tell? I mean, as we've spoken about this before, and just I think there's a tendency for a lot of us to put a lot of hope and faith in students as these kind of energetic actors whose stamina never kind of dies out. But what we've seen over the past couple of months is that these students have faced a level of repression that many of us have never experienced, and I think that's important to highlight that this will impact them as not only students but as individuals moving forward, and their ability to organize and mobilize. So Noor, could you tell us a little bit more about what type of repressive measures these students are currently facing, that they have faced over the last few months, and that they will face in the long term over the coming months as institutions and administrations try to silence them? And then Kylie, I'd also love to hear about your experience with this as well at a different university.
I mean, there are some things I think that we can see nationally speaking, right? So not every university has banned students from campus, but it has happened in a lot of places. Not every university has created the level of housing insecurity as others, given short notice and asking them to move from dorms. But it has happened, right, in certainly more than one place. At UCLA, for example, while no one, at least early on, bans actually came for us the last week of the year, so much later in sort of a series of actions. Students were not in the same way, say at Columbia or Barnard, removed from housing with very short notice. But we know, for example, that from students that live in the dorms, that UCPD, University of California Police Department, have just been roaming the halls in dorms. Like they're just there as also its own intimidation tactic. And of course, they want to present it as a question of security and protection. But it's a chilling effect, right? To especially for students of color. And this is, I think, also a bigger question, is that brown and black students on campuses have absolutely felt the brunt of this to a much larger degree. And we see that in not only questions of demographics of arrests, but those that are most targeted throughout the year. So Kylie made, I think, the very important point that for months and months and months prior to the question of the escalation of these encampments, students have been running actions on campus all year, right? And these encampments and sort of the violence that resulted from the university repression of the encampments, not as a result of the students, of course, has been happening in smaller ways since October, right? So students have been harassed. Muslim women have had their headscarves pulled off. Students have been followed home. Students have been physically attacked, particularly here in LA. A lot of instances of sort of personally, multiple students of mine have been jumped walking home. People jump out of cars and physically attack them. Of course, now infamously, the Zionist mob attack at UCLA, which I call the lynch mob. The students call neo-Nazi night. So they have to differentiate between neo-Nazi night and police night. But, and you have organizations like the Proud Boys showing up sort of across the country at these events. And not only sort of threatening or using verbal assault, but physically attacking students. And so I think there's this question of repression and sort of police and the discipline that universities are enacting. And then there's also this sort of larger community engagement or lack thereof question that's happening in multiple spaces. Disciplinary actions outside of the criminal arrests that have happened are also in full force on most campuses. So that's code of conduct hearings and meetings with students and what that looks like. At UCLA, I can say that that has now begun for faculty and staff that were arrested as well. And so, you know, obviously folks that are untenured are at a different level of vulnerability. But even tenured folks are being brought up on charges in academic senate. We have contingent lecturers, so folks that are not on the tenure track path that were arrested that are now being referred to human resources for violations of employee conduct, being accused of things like incitement. So there's just such a wide array of issues that are being dealt with. But ultimately, we have to name what this is, right? This is not only, though it is this, it is not only a repression of freedom of speech or freedom of expression or assembly. It is a particular speech, right? It is speech on Palestine. It is assembly about Palestine. It is specifically, what do our education institutions look like when we challenge the incredibly problematic notion that equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, right? And so I think that that is key here, and that is something that the students have done brilliantly, I think, which is constantly not only to recenter Palestine and Gaza and the genocide, but also to point out our issue isn't just with freedom of speech. Our issue is about speech on Palestine, and that this is the thing that you won't name, right? And we've had this problem across campuses, by the way, with faculty that want to come out and support students, but don't want to talk about Palestine, right? They want to say, we support our students, we have their backs, we don't want them to get arrested, we think the university is doing something wrong, but they're also not engaging with students about what the content is actually that the students are protesting and are advocating for. So, you know, there's quite a few levels to this, I think, on campuses, and everyone is navigating them to the best of their ability. But I think, to your earlier point, Tarek, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of exhaustion here, and as admirable as the ongoing escalations are, these students have been through a lot, and I think that the summer, hopefully, is also an opportunity not to rest or scale back or quit anything, but to regroup and to sort of think about what comes next. And I see that happening. And so, yeah, I think a lot of us are kind of waiting to see about several issues.
Yeah, Kylie, I'd love to hear about your experience at UNC and what specifically students there are facing now.
Yeah, I think everything Noor says applies across the board, especially in the sense that what the students are bearing is neither just the criminalizing process of being a protester, nor the kind of parallel academic process of sanctions and suspensions and what have you, which are often totally arbitrary. They're up to the university to make these decisions. The same universities often that have called police forces to beat their students on university property. And these academic processes always bring the students in close contact with the very people who have called for them to be beaten by cops, the chancellors, the board of governors, the board of trustees. And without any representation, usually no lawyers, no mediators, just them in the room alone with these folks. So there's that kind of process that they're bearing. But I don't think that it's almost needless to say this, that the students are also bearing the weight of the kind of general organized abandonment, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls it, across the US, which is substituting any life-affirming service, including at the university, with cops. I think the most obvious example of that at UNC is the fact that the Board of Trustees in May struck down DEI, which was a very paltry budget in comparison to what they spend money on, 2.3 million or something to that effect. They struck down DEI funding and are now, they moved that money to the cops. There was no secret about it. They were just we're taking this money and giving it to UNCPD. This is one example of the ways that the universe, like as the students are struggling, they are bearing these consequences, but also bearing the knowledge that what they're working against is a nestled thing. It's the campus, it's the state, it's the country, it's imperialism. And they know it, right? Like they know that what they're struggling against is the biggest beast that the world has ever seen, right? And not to be too dramatic about it. And the reason that the cause for Palestine is so wide, and I know we'll get to a question about how to expand the call to be with Palestine, but the reason it is so wide and has gotten so much wider since October is people see it. It's not a secret that what you're fighting when you are fighting for Palestine is for all of us to live, to be able to live in a society that is practicing that organized abandonment. I think the other thing that makes it really tough, and I think it's worth underlining, is what Noor said about the sort of personalness of the struggle too. So as these universities are attempting to stop any organizing for Palestine, they are attempting to find you. They are identifying you. They are learning your name. They're learning where you live. They're learning your emails, your phone numbers. It is truly like, it is a revolutionary process. It's not just a pantomime of one. It is the process that every revolutionary organization has gone through as it has faced state intimidation, which is when the cops see you in a crowd, and I've seen comrades have this happen to them, they say your name to you, even if you are covered, even if you are attempting to be like standing apart from the crowd or not necessarily, if they think that you are somebody who is in the movement and they think that they know your name, they will personally harass you. They see you as an enemy. And so this is also something that is, I don't know, like, how can I say it? It's intimidating. It's scary to be 18 to 22 years old and bear the aggravation of the state, the aggravation of the place that you live, and know that they're the ones that hold the guns and you don't, right? Especially on a college campus. I did want to like really briefly circle back to the kind of definition of success, because I think that Noor's reminder about what success looks like and how we can actually create a yardstick for it that matters and makes sense in the context in which we're struggling when it is so hard to continue to struggle and feel like you're succeeding at all, is the way that you bear the consequences. So like the kind of answer to the question that you're asking, Tara, or the one that you're asking us to consider about like what impact does this have on us, is only able to be answered when we know that success is something that is a process and not a final kind of like remedy or a programmatic script that we're reaching. And I think that at UNC and across a lot of especially the South, which is very demobilized at this point in history, since the BLM protests, that has been relatively quiet other than the Stop Cop City protests in Atlanta, which have been invigorating across the South, but also difficult, right? The way that we seek success, or at least I'll say that I see success at this moment, is the heightened political consciousness of people that extend beyond students. And it is also the bravery of people who are stepping up for the first time, potentially, or who are continuing to step up in the months since October. I'm particularly pleased by the ways that faculty have organized. I think that it's often assumed that students organize alone and should therefore kind of bear the burden alone. And I think that I'm not trying to overly credit faculty in some cases, because there have been lots of moments where faculty could have stepped up more and didn't in the context of many universities. This is not UNC specific. But at the same time, I recognize, as somebody who has been in the university system since I was 18, this is the first time that I've seen, for instance, the size of FJP chapters, Faculty for Justice in Palestine chapters like this. This is the first time we've ever had them, ever. Or Faculty for Palestine in the context of Canada. The fact that we've seen faculty deoccupations in buildings is amazing. Never would I have thought that we'd see something like this. And we've seen it at the City College at the University of New York and other kind of places like that, where faculty are themselves seeing this collapse between students and faculty. The kind of formal, rigid structure that's supposed to keep us separate is sort of like a class understanding, right? That, oh, okay, yeah, like the university is imposing this like formality on us because they don't want us to organize together. But when we organize together, is much easier, and we're much stronger for it. I think that goes for a lot of the kind of sectors of the US that have been kept apart too. I think famously, not to dwell too long on the South, but sorry, I'm a Southern girl. The South has always been apart from the other organizing nodes in the US. And maybe that's the biggest distinction of it, right? That there has been sort of the New York node, which includes like Boston, Philadelphia. Like there's this kind of big metropolitan node in the Northeast. There's the West Coast. There's even some Midwest, right, oriented around Chicago. And then as far as the South is concerned, it's just Texas, and just like Texas with Texas, which makes sense because of course it does. Huge Arab population, very strong legacies of organizing. But in the rest of the South, especially the Deep South, there's been just like a lot of atomized organizing. And for the first time, the South is not alone, right? And is connecting not only with each other, there are now chats and connections between various SJPs in the Carolinas, for instance, and are talking constantly to each other, but across states, right? And so the kind of wider political organizing is also a success, even though it may not feel like it yet. And just to tie it back to what I was saying about like the kind of nestled process of resisting fascism, yields burdens and punishments for students that may be difficult to bear. The fact that they are still being born is a success, right? As students are continuing to bear the burdens of the legal cases that they are being levied with, often to excess, especially in the case of racialized students, excessive charges, excessive consequences. Students still are taking up the cause, right? And even if we are taking a moment to reorganize, which I think is a topic we'll also talk about, right? Like, what does the future look like in terms of tactics? Even if we are taking this moment to reorganize, I don't think that there is any doubt that this isn't over, right? And students are still emboldened to continue and are not being afraid of the court cases that are being levied on them. So that's a success as well.
Thanks, Kylie. I'm glad you touched on the goal, the wider goal of reaching people beyond, reaching people and communities beyond the universities and the campuses that we've seen. So I think my next question is, how can the protest movement, or how can the student-led movement ensure that it remains, inclusive, intersectional, and ideologically consistent and committed, while also expanding that wider umbrella of support when it comes to just getting other Americans on board in this process that might entail, down the line having to make rhetoric changes and language adjustments. How is that, being debated and approached?
To Noor or to me?
Oh, if any of you have Noor, do you wanna start, and then
sure.
Kylie?
Sure. Yeah, it's fine. Either way, it doesn't matter. I mean, one thing that I think is important too is, and it goes along with this question of sort of community engagement and so on, is that these encampments were not just sit-ins or occupations, right? They were and are erections of popular universities for liberation. And they are spaces that centered education and reciprocity and care. And the diversity of the community in these popular universities was also a reflection of how much, which Kylie alluded to as well, of how much of a gap there is between the principles of our university administrators and what they claim, and what students actually enacted without them, and then their reaction to that, right? These spaces of generative creativity and commitment to justice and human rights were constantly under threat at every turn by Zionist attacks and police brutality. And yet what's most impressive to me is that the response to all of that wasn't students not only not them breaking or backing down, but it was them becoming more committed to each other as a community and taking care of each other, right? We protect us, we take care of us. We had a student in the encampment relay to some of the organizers that this was the first time, which, I mean, what does that tell you about America? This was the first time in their lives that they had shelter, medical care, all of their meals provided, right? We had the medics tent, we had like medicine and supplies over the counter, etc. There was the kitchen tent, there was an art space, There were extra blankets. Community members were coming in all of the time, bringing donations. And, what does it say for a 20-year-old kid to essentially, for the first time in their lives, feel safe? And that was happening right on this campus that they allegedly have, been a part of this campus community for years as sophomores or juniors, et cetera. But it was the encampment that brought them safety and community. And part of that was the sort of university affiliated individuals that were part of this encampment, but a lot of that was also outside of that, right? So people coming in from the community, not only to donate food, but to be there for the students, people bringing children, bringing their pets. And there was a lot of sort of these moments that I think now it's almost really hard to put ourselves back in that space because so much has happened. As of a week ago when we were originally scheduled to have this call, students were still bruised, literally, from an action on June 10th at UCLA, in which police came and kettled and beat and arrested and then detained in a university building, a building that most of us teach in and go to class in. That was the same night that a student with a megaphone who was just on the front of in the middle of the protest, not engaging, not like doing anything with, it sort of in front of the cops, et cetera, was literally just snatched out of the crowd, dragged up steps and then detained. And then she was charged with assault, right? So we have these incredibly intense moments of not only sort of brutal repression and intimidation, but just experiences of sort of violence on our campuses. But on the other hand, I think those tend to overshadow also the beauty of what sort of the encampments and the work that the students have been doing over the past year are, as sort of Kylie mentioned. And so I think it's important sometimes to also reground ourselves in that and understand that these students are very much rooted in sort of making sure that this movement is not only engaging with the wider community, but that it's rooted in sort of, as Kylie mentioned, national and global conversations around decolonization, around imperialism, around capitalism, and a very deep recognition that all of this is tied and that the US in particular is marching towards fascism at an alarming rate, not just on our university campuses, but at our local, city, state, and national government levels, right? And that connection and that intersectionality, as you sort of alluded to, Tarek, is not something that is lost on the student movement whatsoever.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think that the question of how to ensure whether the movement remains inclusive and intersectional is almost one that I think I don't have a good answer for it, because the answer is that it is inherently intersectional. It's inherently inclusive. It's just as an example, UNC's chapter is extremely queer, is extremely Jewish, is extremely led by like people of color, so it's like, this is what it looks like, because we understand that Palestine is not only besieged by forces that oppress all of us equally, right? Like, it's not just like the bombs that are used over there are not ones that affect us here. We understand from the Ferguson moment that the tear gas that is used over there is the same tear gas that is used over here, the same tear gas that I was literally tear gassed by in BLM protests in the summer of 2020. The same cops that went over there for training are the same ones that deployed it. The same drones that are watching us in the sky over the rallies and protests are like Elbit system drones, or could be, right? Like, we know that the technology circuit is a flat circle, right? Like, it's not a Venn diagram of things. It's the same thing. It's the same thing everywhere, to different degrees of effect, right? Like, our cities are not flattened in the same way that Gaza is, but it doesn't mean it couldn't be, right? Like, we are living in a continuous temporality. And so I think that, like, I guess I'd love to hear from people who feel like that they're not seen in the movement. As a queer woman myself, I feel very seen in the movement. I feel like I'm in my people, and I have been with my people for the entire time that I've been 10 plus years that I've been in this movement now, right? So I think that as far as like who is in the movement, it's inherently intersectional and inherently inclusive. I think as far as rhetoric goes, we don't have to be inclusive or like we have to be intersexual, but like inclusive to the sense of like, yes, everybody can be here. But the job of organizing and organizations is actually to define the boundary of what is acceptable. And there is an outside of the boundary. There is racism, there is Zionism, there is sexism, there is homophobia. And the movement has been very good up until from October until now, has been very good at changing the rhetoric to be even more human oriented in its rhetoric, right? To be pro-resistance is to be for the cause of humanity. To be for Palestinians is to be for the cause of humanity. And that does mean that we don't accept racists and people who are both sides about it, two-state solutioners, people who actually have no interest or no business with humanity and are just out for themselves. So I think that because the job of the various organizations that make up the cause is this, I think our job is to continue to be not so much interested in sort of like this broad tent inclusivity that could potentially include these anti-humans, I would call them, but instead be more firm about the rhetoric that is acceptable, right? And I also think that like, I wanted to address what Noor was saying about some of the things that she was saying about like how students have recognized each other and commitments to each other have gone deeper, and what that means about like how we make sure that we're inclusive. One thing that is like very practical about how we have to be inclusive is by understanding that the repressive forces that are arrayed against us understand what they're doing against us as a longevity game, right? Like if they can outlast us, then we will just go away. That's the plan here. And that was the plan of the smarter encampments, right? The smarter university administrators who were dealing with encampments was to ignore them, which is what's happened at UBC, for instance. For the most part, the university was attempting to ignore the encampment. I know that there's potentially some stuff happening there that I can't say, but that is like the kind of larger thing, right? On the one hand, repress, on the other hand, sort of suppress selectively, or sorry, ignore, I mean. And I think that understanding that this is a waiting game means that inclusivity also has to include politics of taking care of each other, right? Like not just politics of care as in like kind of the therapizing language, but the like, are people eating, right? That Noor was talking about. Are they getting medical access? Are they getting things that they need in order to continue? Because this is practically like a way to survive. We have to survive so that this is a marathon that we can survive and not one that they will outlast us and outweigh us until we just fall apart as like human bodies, right? And so I think that that has a lot to do with like, yeah, the inclusivity question, to be honest.
And I would add to Tariq to your question is that, I mean, not to, because I also don't want to sort of be guilty of sort of putting rose-colored glasses on and recognizing that, I mean, it's a solidarity movement. And even if it wasn't a solidarity movement, it's like, not like there's any lack of division or argument within Palestinian movement, national movement for that matter. It doesn't need to even be limited to the question of solidarity. Yes, right. You have and will always have moments of tension in organizing, not only among students, but questions of class and privilege, race, gender, all of these things, right? But I do think, to Kylie's point, right, there has been such an explicit effort by students to address that to the best of their ability. It doesn't mean that every situation is perfect and that there aren't moments where folks fall short. But the guiding sort of ethic is of sort of inclusivity has been certainly ever present. And, even to this point of physically of our bodies and taking care of our bodies and so on. I wouldn't eat, right? I'd be helping, whatever. And it was the students who would just like a random freshman would walk up and be like, would you like they're like passing out pizza. Like, would you like a piece of pizza? Also, your face is getting a little red. Would you like some sunscreen? I'm like, why are you taking care of me? You know, and it actually takes a moment to remind yourself after, you know, I have family in Gaza and so on, so 9 months of genocide and literally every day waking up and thinking about who's alive and who isn't and who has made it and who has moved to safe housing in Gaza. And suddenly to be surrounded by 19-year-olds who are concerned about whether or not there's sunscreen on my face, in some ways was quite jarring, and in other ways was also an incredible reminder of your humanity and your connection to other people. And now I feel awful because I'm not going to be able to cite this person appropriately, but there is an author, an amazing author out there, who writes that the opposite of dispossession is not possession, it's connection, right? It is about us sort of reinvigorating and sort of those bonds with each other. And then that's what we actually saw happen. And what we continue to see happen, not only in the US, but internationally. You know, I just came back from a trip in Europe, and I met students from Switzerland, from the Netherlands, from Germany, and the creativity and the amount of not only sort of similar experiences, but the dedication that's there and the degree to which they see themselves as a part of a global struggle, I think is incredibly important. And it is, in a lot of ways, historically, and Shabaka, you know, as a network writes about this a lot, different authors. It is a revival in a lot of ways of Ayyam al-Thawra al-Palestiniya. Not in the sense, obviously, that this is the Palestinian national movement, but it is an engagement with sort of the history and the ethic of the global nature of that movement, and understanding how tied sort of global anti-imperial and decolonial struggles are. So I think all of that is really critical, not only framing for us to think about, but to engage with as we think about how to build this into stronger waves moving forward, right? And what will, we hope, be a post-ceasefire scenario.
Yeah, thank you, Noor. I think that's a good point to jump into some of the questions from the audience, actually, because there's a couple of really good ones. I think I want to start with the second one on the list, just going on, you know, kind of tying back into the question about, you know, reaching a wider audience, expanding the umbrella, and making sure this movement continues even long after there is a ceasefire, like you said, Noor. Are there plans to someone asked this specific question, are there plans to study the news discourse and how these students were represented in the media? Because that's something that weighed on my mind a lot. And just the, you know, the specific, the warmongering and the fear mongering, and the vilifying of these students individually and the student movement as a whole. What are your thoughts on what's being done to navigate that environment, that hostile media environment? Kylie, do you want to tackle that one to start us off?
Yeah, sure. I'm no media expert, and I admit that I mostly forsake media in general because it doesn't do a very good job of actually representing the truth. I think that this is sort of the perennial question of how you move against the state, right? The state has apprehended all media outlets, or they are sort of symbiotic entities, right? There's not really a mainstream resistance related or like anti-US lefty media outlet in the US, nor is there actually an oppositional political party, right? Like the US is entirely right wing, and so are all of the media outlets. And so for those reasons, I think that most of us have sort of forsaken any true media representation. And honestly, most of the organizations that I know are very selective when they talk to the media, right? Like they don't necessarily give interviews. I know, for instance, UNCSJP does not talk to the campus paper because it absolutely refuses to do ethical journalism. And I think that that politics of refusal to engage with these bad faith representations is a tactic. I personally think it's an effective tactic. I don't think that they get to make their funding or money or whatever based on the lies that they tell about the movement. And I also see us as a part of a longer heritage of resistance. Like Noor was saying, we are not the same as the resistance organizations, of course, and nor would we ever want to be in the context of the US in some ways. But also, like, we are taking from their example the idea that you do not have to play into these bad narratives by giving them air, right? We are not activists who have been paid for by George Soros or whatever whatever the heck they're saying about us. We are not people who are professional activists who are paid to do this. This is a labor of love, love for the Palestinian people and love for ourselves and our people and all of humanity. I think that the other things are like tried and true tactics that are failing actually the Zionists now. For instance, the labeling of the movement as anti-Semitic is one that is increasingly bearing no water. The largest anti-Zionist organization in the US is Jewish Voice for Peace. There's only so long that Zionists can be like, you're not real Jews, before it's like, interesting. It does seem like there is a quite significant population of Jews who would call themselves Jews, who understand themselves as Jews and would not say that they are Zionists and are explicitly anti-Zionist. And so I think that this is such a Southern thing to say. The proof is in the pudding, right? Like the narratives that they tell about us are only believable so long as people don't actually engage with the movement. And I think that as the movement continues to grow and grow more prolific, take up more space, take up more time, and tell our own stories in our own voices, the more that we do that, the less that we have to care about the way that we're being represented.
Oh, Noor, I think you're muted. There you go.
Sorry. I was going to say, I agree with all of that. And I see those parallels at UCLA to very similar sort of decisions by media team at SJP media team at UCLA, particularly in regards to her example of the school paper, which had a couple of really phenomenal reporters, one of whom was attacked during the mob attack night and did incredible reporting on it, and then was essentially pressured to resign. And all sort of like decent journalism at the local paper became untrustworthy to students. And so you see that across campuses. And there are different decisions that are made in regards to media engagement, all of which are legitimate for various SJPs and where they're located, because there are some context specific issues that are happening. That said, I think there have been a lot of really incredible sort of articles, whether it's by faculty or scholars or other activists or poets or whatever, that have been published over the course of the last year, that really, run a spear through the heart of the disingenuous and absurd media narratives that we have all been kind of exposed to. Everything from sort of the lies around beheaded babies and rape allegations to this question of equating anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And to a large degree at this point, anyone that is unwilling to be confronted with those contradictions, it's a choice that they're making. It is not for a lack of information that is present that has highlighted these contradictions. So I don't know if there's like plans sort of officially to study the news discourse, et cetera. I'm sure this year will bear us many, many years of dissertations to come. God help us all. But that said, I think there is a sort of deep and knowledgeable understanding of what we have seen evolve in the news this year. And there's already been a lot of really brilliant stuff that's kind of been put out, and I'm sure we'll see much more. But one aspect of this is that these students are very, very aware of how they're being represented, and the other part of this, as Kylie points out, is that they don't care. I mean, not completely. I mean, they care to some degree, but not to a debilitating or demobilizing degree. right? It is not going to be the thing that stops them, basically.
Thanks, Noor. One more question I want to get to. We have 3-4 more minutes, but it's this top one. Is there a national coalition, either formal or informal, that is kind of organizing and working together to think about and approach strategy and tactics moving forward into the fall? Kylie, do you want to try that first?
Yeah, I was hoping we would get into the tactics question. So I think that the answer is that the movement for Palestine across Turtle Island is leaderless in some ways, right? And I think that this is a productive or generative space for it to be in. That there are organizations at the national level. There is the Palestinian Youth Movement. There is National Students for Justice in Palestine. There is Samidoun. There are other organizations that are national and internationally rooted that are responsive to individual chapters and the local conditions, right? And does some level of coordinating, different levels of coordinating within each of those organizations. And many organizations, especially international or national, have some relationship with each other, but there is no unifying tactic book. There is no sort of like the Communist Manifesto for the Palestine movement that we're operating with. Maybe that would be great, but it's not what we have, and it's not the space that we're in. And it's partially because the conversation we started having at the very beginning was that like each campus movement is very different from each other. Each encampment was very different from each other. Each of the local conditions that we're operating in, there are so many reasons why they're different, but they're so different, right? And so a unifying tactics book will not necessarily yield productive results for kind of mobilizing the engine of the movement, right? That being said, I think that the encampments were a unifying moment, one of the first sort of unifying moments across the movement, because we were all trying the same tactic or a similar kind of tactic at almost the same time, right? And I think that because of the lessons that we learned, since most of these encampments rose within the span of a couple of months of each other, and then the vast majority of them have now been scuttled by each of the administrations on the campuses. I think that the fall will also be a similarly unifying moment, right? And this will not be because there's some kind of like control mechanism, but because we did experience this together, right? We experienced this together at the same time. I personally think that we are all aware that tactics need to change, right? For all that the encampments were an incredible, beautiful, radical, revolutionary space, they were also resource-intensive spaces. And I think that this summer has been demobilizing, not just because it's summer, and it is naturally demobilizing for students who are leaving for various reasons, right? But also because they're exhausting. The encampments were an exhausting exercise, not just for the students themselves who had to sustain them day in, day out, but also the local communities often who were supporting them in various ways, from delivering food to helping staff like safety shifts or delivering materials, funding, yada, yada, yada. And so a lot of civil society organizing, and this is just anecdotal, in the places that I know and have been organizing in, a lot of them have become also like demobilized in a certain sense, because we did this tactic that absorbed so much resources in terms of manpower and in terms of like material stuff. I think that, you know, we are all kind of recollecting our energy and trying to think of what it actually means to sort of tactically move in the future, particularly given the fact that, as we've all learned and as we've talked about in this call, the kind of police repression that has followed the encampments is also ramped up, right? The felonies that a lot of students have collected, especially racialized students, but the misdemeanors as well, and all of the crimes that student activists have been accused of, often going to court, right, will deplete the manpower. So what does it mean to not be able to have as many arrests, not to bear as many arrests as we once could? One is, of course, that we have to expand the movement again, put roots down, expand the roots. But the other, I think, is to adopt the tactics that have worked in other revolutionary movements, which is to move quickly and not get caught. And so holding space in the encampments was symbolically beautiful and important. Creating that space outside of capitalism, if we could be so flattering to ourselves, an anti-capitalist space is important. but it is a vulnerable position to be in. And I think we all know that now. We were waiting for the cops to roll us. We were waiting for the Zionists to come up. We were waiting for all of the racists to find us because they knew where we were. And we can't always bear that. There is a time and place for that tactic, but there's also a deep need to adopt tactics that are mobile, secretive, faster, without identification of the fascists. And I think that that's where we're at when we approach the fall.
I think that's a great place to leave off. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we could keep going since there's so many good questions here in this chat.
Just one small thing to this question.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, Tarek. I know you're on a schedule. I want to add sort of to Kylie's point. I agree, but also I think it's important to note that we're already seeing that happen in a lot of places. So the tactics have, after a lot of the encampments got cleared, escalations didn't end. Right. And so you saw that adaptation happen. If you look at a space like UCLA and numerous others, this is not unique to us, but the question of mobile encampments begin, right? You set up, you disperse, you clear, you set up again, you disperse, you clear. And I'm not saying that that always ends well, that there are never arrests, et cetera, but the sort of, operating, be water, get out of there, et cetera. Questions of, for lack of a better word, increased kind of guerrilla tactics, you're already kind of seeing happen across campuses. And so to the original question of, is there a national coalition? No, not formally. But I think what you do see, in addition to things like National SJP and National JBP and all of these organizations that are in touch with each other, is also a very organic learning process. And students who are sort of naturally tied, whether it's because they're tied to their home and they study out of state, et cetera, and so they're tied to each other, but also via some of these national organizations, a lot of organic conversations that are building, and I think will continue to build out over the summer, not in a sense of necessarily, formal parties or organizations the way that we may be used to conceptualizing them, but certainly a lot of like organic learning that is happening across the national movement, and I think that we will see what that bears out in the fall, certainly.
Thanks, Noor, and thanks, Kylie. Thanks everybody for joining us today. And before we sign off, I just wanted to remind you all that these policy labs are a crowd-funded program of Al-Shabaka, so we'd be super thankful for any contributions that you can make. If you are able to donate, please do so by clicking the donate button that should appear somewhere on your screens. And thanks again for joining us and taking the time out of your day. And stay tuned for our next policy lab next month.
Thanks so much for having us, Tarek.
Thank you, Tarek.